What I'm about to tell you will shock you. It was supposed to be their first week at TechFlow Industries, one of the most prestigious software companies in Silicon Valley. Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez had just been hired as junior database administrators, fresh out of college with computer science degrees and dreams of making their mark in the tech world. They walked into the gleaming office building on Monday morning, badges gleaming, laptops in hand, ready to prove themselves. 90% of people who watch aren't subscribed. If you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel now. What nobody knew that morning was that by Friday afternoon, these two eager new hires would accidentally trigger the biggest corporate disaster in the company's 15-year history. The irony was devastating. They were hired specifically to protect the company's most valuable asset, but instead, they would be the ones to destroy it completely. TechFlow Industries wasn't just any company. They managed cloud infrastructure for over 200,000 businesses worldwide, from small startups to Fortune 500 corporations. Their main database contained everything: customer information, financial records, transaction histories, backup configurations, and security protocols worth over $800 million. This wasn't just data. It was the lifeblood of thousands of companies who trusted TechFlow with their most critical business operations. Sarah had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a specialty in database management. She'd spent 4 years studying every aspect of data architecture, backup systems, and recovery protocols. Her thesis on distributed database optimization had been published in 3 academic journals. Marcus came from MIT with a focus on cybersecurity and database encryption. His professors called him a prodigy, someone who could identify system vulnerabilities that others missed completely. But what they saw in their first week, nobody ever discovered the full truth. The hiring process had taken 6 months. TechFlow's CTO, David Kim, had personally interviewed over 300 candidates before selecting Sarah and Marcus. The company was expanding rapidly, and they needed fresh talent who could handle the increasing complexity of their database operations. The existing team was overwhelmed, working 80-hour weeks just to maintain the current systems. David had high hopes for the new hires. During the EO interviews, both Sarah and Marcus had demonstrated exceptional technical knowledge and problem-solving abilities. They understood complex database architectures, could write efficient SQL queries, and had impressive internship experiences at major tech companies. On paper, they were exactly what TechFlow needed. If you were in their position, walking into your dream job, you'd never imagine that within 5 days you'd become the protagonists of a corporate nightmare. The onboarding process was thorough, or so everyone thought. Sarah and Marcus spent their first 3 days in training sessions, learning about TechFlow's proprietary systems, security protocols, and backup procedures. They attended presentations about the company's client base, revenue streams, and growth projections. Everything seemed perfectly organized and professional. The training covered database management best practices, emergency response procedures, and the critical importance of the backup systems. They learned about the primary database server, the secondary backup server, and the tertiary safety backup stored in a separate facility across the country. Multiple layers of protection, they were told. Foolproof systems that had been tested hundreds of times. Sarah took detailed notes during every session, asking thoughtful questions about optimization techniques and performance monitoring. Marcus focused on the security aspects, wanting to understand every firewall, encryption protocol, and access control measure. Both of them felt confident and prepared for their new responsibilities. But 3 days later, the impossible happened. On Thursday morning, Sarah and Marcus were finally given administrator access to the main database systems. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Real responsibility, real impact on the company's operations. Their supervisor, Jennifer Walsh, had been with TechFlow for 8 years and was considered one of the most reliable database administrators in the industry. Jennifer walked them through the daily monitoring procedures, showing them how to check system performance, identify potential issues, and run routine maintenance scripts. She explained the backup schedules: automatic backups every 4 hours, full system backups every 24 hours, and manual verification procedures that were performed weekly. The truth was hiding right in front of everyone, but nobody saw the signs until it was too late. That Thursday afternoon, Marcus noticed something unusual in the system logs. There were small inconsistencies in the backup verification reports from the previous week. Nothing alarming, just minor discrepancies that most administrators would have ignored. But Marcus's attention to detail, the same quality that had made him valedictorian at MIT, wouldn't let him overlook these anomalies. He mentioned his concerns to Sarah during their lunch break. She agreed that they should investigate further, even though Jennifer had already left for a long weekend vacation. As new employees, they felt pressure to prove themselves, to show that they were proactive and thorough in their work. And that's when the countdown to disaster truly began. Friday morning arrived with an unusual sense of urgency in the TechFlow offices. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, and executives were scrambling to prepare performance reports that would showcase the company's growth and reliability to potential investors. The timing couldn't have been worse for what was about to unfold. Sarah arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual. She wanted to follow up on the backup inconsistencies that Marcus had discovered the day before. The office was nearly empty, with only a few dedicated employees scattered across the massive open workspace. The early morning silence was broken only by the gentle hum of hundreds of servers running in the data center below. Marcus was already at his desk when Sarah walked in, his multiple monitors displaying cascading lines of system logs and diagnostic reports. He had been there since 6 a.m., diving deeper into the backup verification anomalies. What he had found during those early morning hours would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Sarah, you need to see this," Marcus said, his voice carrying a tension that immediately put her on alert. His screen showed the backup system's log files from the past 2 weeks, with several entries highlighted in red. The backup verification scripts have been failing intermittently, but the system has been reporting them as successful. The implications were staggering. If the backup verification was failing, it meant that some of the recent backups might be corrupted or incomplete. But the automated reporting system was masking these failures, creating a false sense of security that had gone unnoticed by the senior administrators. Sarah pulled up her own terminal and began cross-referencing the backup logs with the actual backup files stored on the secondary servers. What she discovered made her stomach drop. Nearly 30% of the backups from the previous week showed signs of data corruption or incomplete file transfers. The backup system that everyone trusted implicitly had been quietly failing for days. "We need to report this immediately," Sarah said, reaching for her phone to call Jennifer. But then she remembered that Jennifer was on vacation and wouldn't be back until Tuesday. Their other supervisor, Michael Chen, was at a conference in Austin and wouldn't return until Monday afternoon. The weight of responsibility fell squarely on their shoulders. As the most junior members of the database team, they were now faced with a critical system issue that could affect hundreds of thousands of clients. The pressure to handle the situation correctly was immense, but their eagerness to prove themselves clouded their judgment. Marcus suggested they attempt to fix the backup verification scripts themselves. After all, they had both studied these exact types of problems extensively in university. The solution seemed straightforward. Identify the corrupted backups, delete them, and run fresh backup procedures to replace them with clean copies. Sarah agreed, but suggested they first create a manual backup of the entire primary database as an additional safety measure. This decision, which seemed prudent and responsible at the time, would later be identified as the first step toward catastrophe. They were following protocol, being careful, doing everything by the book, or so they thought. Working together, they began the manual backup process at 9:15 a.m. The primary database contained 847 terabytes of critical data, and the backup procedure was estimated to take approximately 6 hours to complete. During this time, the system would be running normally, but with slightly reduced performance due to the intensive backup operations. Everything proceeded smoothly for the first 3 hours. The backup progress indicator showed steady advancement, and all system monitors displayed normal operating parameters. Sarah and Marcus took turns monitoring the process while handling their other daily responsibilities, feeling confident that they were managing the situation professionally. But at 12:43 p.m., something went wrong. The backup process encountered an unexpected error, a rare conflict between the manual backup procedure and one of the automated maintenance scripts that ran during the lunch hour. The error message that appeared on Marcus's screen was cryptic and unfamiliar, not covered in any of their training materials. Most people who watch forget to subscribe. Don't be another one. Subscribe now. The error message that flashed across Marcus's screen at 12:43 p.m. would later be analyzed by dozens of forensic specialists, but in that moment, it was just a confusing string of technical jargon that neither Sarah nor Marcus fully understood. Database integrity check failed. Manual backup process terminated. Primary database locked for maintenance mode. Error code, DB critical 0x7F92. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart rate immediately spiking. This wasn't just any error message. The word critical made his hands shake as he tried to process what was happening. The primary database, which served hundreds of thousands of active clients, had been automatically locked into maintenance mode, effectively cutting off access to all external users. Sarah rushed over to Marcus's workstation, her coffee cup still in hand. When she saw the error message, she nearly dropped it. "What does that error code mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They both frantically searched through the system documentation, but error code DB critical 07F92 wasn't listed anywhere in their training materials. The immediate priority was to get the primary database back online. Every minute it remained locked meant potential revenue loss and angry clients calling the customer service department. Sarah suggested they try the standard database recovery procedures they had learned during training, while Marcus attempted to contact someone from the senior database team. But it was Friday afternoon, and most of the senior staff had already left for the weekend. The few who remained were in meetings or handling other critical issues. Marcus left urgent voicemails for 3 different supervisors, but none of them called back immediately. The new hires were on their own with a crisis that was escalating by the minute. If you were facing a career-ending mistake in your first week, would you have the courage to admit you needed help? Sarah initiated the first recovery procedure at 1:07 p.m. The process was designed to safely restart the database systems and restore normal operations within 30 minutes. But instead of resolving the issue, the recovery procedure triggered a cascade of additional errors. The secondary backup server, which should have automatically taken over during the maintenance mode, began displaying similar critical error messages. Marcus watched in horror as red warning indicators began appearing across all of his monitoring screens. The system logs were flooding with error messages faster than he could read them. Database connections were being dropped, backup processes were failing, and the automatic failover systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this type of situation weren't responding correctly. "We need to stop everything and get help," Sarah said, her professional composure finally cracking. But Marcus, driven by a combination of panic and pride, insisted they could fix it themselves. He had spent 4 years at MIT learning how to troubleshoot complex database problems, and he wasn't ready to admit defeat on his first major challenge. The many people who watch still aren't subscribed. If you like this, subscribe. At 1:23 p.m., Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of the crisis. He decided to manually restart the primary database server, bypassing the automated recovery systems that were clearly malfunctioning. This was an advanced procedure that typically required approval from senior management, but with no supervisors available and clients being affected, he felt he had no choice. The manual restart process required temporarily shutting down all database connections and clearing the system cache before bringing the servers back online. Marcus followed the procedure exactly as he had learned it, double-checking each step against the technical documentation. Sarah stood beside him, verifying each command before he executed it. At 1:34 p.m., Marcus typed the final command to restart the primary database server. For a moment, everything seemed to work perfectly. The error messages stopped, the monitoring screens returned to normal colors, and the system status indicators showed that the database was coming back online. But their relief lasted exactly 47 seconds. At 1:35 p.m., a new error message appeared that would haunt both of them forever. Primary database corruption detected. All backup verification failed. System integrity compromised. Manual intervention required. But what happened in those 47 seconds changed everything forever. The silence in the office was deafening. Sarah and Marcus stared at the screen, reading and rereading the error message as if the words might somehow change. Primary database corruption detected. Those 4 words represented the worst-case scenario that every database administrator feared but never expected to actually encounter. Marcus's hands were trembling as he attempted to run a diagnostic scan to assess the extent of the corruption. The results that appeared on his screen defied everything they had learned about database systems and backup protocols. According to the diagnostic, 73% of the primary database showed signs of corruption, affecting core tables that contained customer data, financial records, and system configurations. Sarah immediately attempted to access the secondary backup server, which should have contained a complete, uncorrupted copy of all the data from just hours earlier. But when she tried to connect, she was met with another devastating message. Secondary backup server offline. Last successful backup. 6 days ago. The realization hit them both simultaneously. The backup verification failures that Marcus had discovered that morning weren't just minor glitches. They represented a systematic breakdown of the entire backup infrastructure that had been ongoing for nearly a week. While they had been focused on fixing the immediate problem, they hadn't realized that their safety net had already been compromised. "How is this possible?" Sarah whispered, pulling up the backup system logs on her own terminal. The automated reports had been showing successful backups every 4 hours for the past week, but the actual backup files were either corrupted, incomplete, or in some cases completely missing. Marcus discovered that the backup verification scripts had been modified 3 weeks earlier during a routine system update. The IT modification was supposed to improve performance, but it had introduced a subtle bug that caused the scripts to report false positives. Instead of actually verifying the integrity of backup files, the scripts were simply checking whether backup files existed, regardless of whether they contained valid data. The tertiary backup system, their final safety net, was stored at a remote facility 200 miles away. Sarah immediately called the facility to request an emergency restoration from their offline backup servers. But the technician who answered the phone delivered another crushing blow. The tertiary backup system had been offline for maintenance since Wednesday morning, and wouldn't be operational again until Monday. By 2:15 p.m., the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The primary database was corrupted, the secondary backup system had been failing for days, and the tertiary backup was inaccessible until Monday. TechFlow Industries, a company built on the promise of reliable data management, had somehow lost its most valuable asset in the span of a few hours. The customer service department was already fielding calls from confused clients who couldn't access their accounts or retrieve their data. Sarah could hear the phone conversations from across the office as frustrated support representatives tried to explain temporary system maintenance to increasingly angry customers. Marcus attempted one last desperate measure, a manual data recovery procedure that involved extracting individual database tables from the corrupted files and reconstructing them piece by piece. The process was extremely time-intensive and had a low probability of success, but it was their only remaining option. Working frantically, they managed to recover approximately 15% of the customer data over the next 3 hours. But the recovered data was fragmented and inconsistent, missing critical relationships between tables that made much of it unusable. Worse, the recovery process was so slow that it would take weeks to recover even half of the lost information. At 5:30 p.m., as the sun was setting outside the TechFlow offices, Sarah made the phone call that neither of them wanted to make. She dialed the emergency contact number for David Kim, the CTO who had personally hired them just 1 week earlier. "David, this is Sarah Chen. I'm calling because we have a critical situation with the primary database system. We need immediate assistance." Her voice was steady, but Marcus could see the tears forming in her eyes as she prepared to explain how their first week of employment had resulted in the destruction of their company's most valuable asset. David Kim was at his daughter's soccer game when he received the call. As Sarah explained the situation, he felt his world collapsing around him. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, where he was supposed to present TechFlow's growth, metrics and reliability statistics to potential investors who were considering a $150 million funding round. "How much data are we talking about?" David asked, hoping against hope that the damage was limited to a small subset of non-critical information. Sarah's response was barely audible. "All of it, David. We've lost access to the entire primary database, and all backup systems have failed. Only 20% of those watching are subscribed. If you liked this, don't forget to subscribe." David Kim's hands were shaking as he hung up the phone and immediately dialed the number for TechFlow's emergency response team. Within 30 minutes, the company's entire senior management team was racing back to the office, abandoning their weekend plans to confront the biggest crisis in the company's history. By 6:45 p.m., the TechFlow offices had transformed into a war room. 12 senior engineers, 3 department heads, and 2 external consultants were gathered around the main conference table, laptops open, trying to understand exactly how a company with multiple layers of backup protection could lose everything in a single afternoon. The forensic analysis began immediately. Every command that Sarah and Marcus had executed was scrutinized, every system log was examined, and every backup file was tested for integrity. What the investigation revealed was worse than anyone had imagined. The backup system failures weren't the result of the new hires' actions, but rather a systemic problem that had been building for weeks. Rachel Morrison, TechFlow's head of infrastructure, discovered that the backup verification bug had been introduced during a routine security update 3 weeks earlier. The update had been tested extensively on the development servers, but a critical difference between the development and production environments had caused the backup verification scripts to fail silently in the live system. "This means we haven't had reliable backups for almost a month," Rachel announced to the room, her voice barely concealing her anger. "The system has been living on borrowed time, and what happened today was inevitable. If it hadn't been Sarah and Marcus, it would have been someone else next week or next month. But this revelation, while absolving the new hires of direct responsibility, didn't solve the immediate problem. TechFlow still had 200,000 business clients who were unable to access their critical data, and every hour of downtime was costing the company approximately $2.3 million in lost revenue and potential lawsuits. The customer service department was overwhelmed with angry phone calls. Major clients like Pinnacle Financial Services and Global Tech Solutions were threatening to terminate their contracts immediately unless their data was restored within 24 hours. The legal department was preparing for an avalanche of lawsuits from businesses that relied on TechFlow's services for their daily operations. Sarah and Marcus remained in the office through the night, working alongside the senior engineers to attempt data recovery procedures. The guilt they felt was overwhelming, even though they now understood that the underlying problems predated their employment. They had been hired to prevent exactly this type of disaster, but instead they had become the unwitting catalyst for its occurrence. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this one. By 2 a.m. Saturday morning, the recovery efforts had yielded disappointing results. The senior engineers had managed to restore approximately 30% of the customer data, but the recovered information was incomplete and often corrupted. Critical financial records were missing, customer account balances were inconsistent, and transaction histories had gaps that made them legally unreliable. The media had somehow gotten wind of the story. At 3:15 a.m., TechFlow's communications director received a call from a journalist at TechCrunch asking for comment on reports of a massive data breach at one of Silicon Valley's most trusted cloud service providers. Within hours, the story would be spreading across every major technology news website. David Kim called an emergency board meeting for Saturday afternoon. He spent the early morning hours preparing a presentation that would explain the situation to investors and board members who had entrusted him with building a reliable, profitable company. The funding round that was supposed to be announced on Monday was now in serious jeopardy. The investigation revealed additional troubling details about the company's backup infrastructure. The tertiary backup system that was supposed to be their ultimate safety net had been experiencing intermittent failures for 2 months, but these failures had been dismissed as minor technical issues that didn't require immediate attention. More damaging still was the discovery that TechFlow's disaster recovery procedures, which looked comprehensive on paper, had never been tested in a real-world scenario. The company had been operating under the assumption that their backup systems would work perfectly when needed, but no one had ever verified this assumption through actual testing. If you had been responsible for protecting $800 million worth of data, how would you have handled the pressure? As Saturday morning progressed, the true scope of the crisis became clear. This wasn't just a technical problem that could be solved with better equipment or more skilled personnel. It was a fundamental failure of corporate governance and risk management that had left one of Silicon Valley's most prominent companies vulnerable to exactly the type of catastrophic data loss that their clients paid them to prevent. The irony was devastating. TechFlow had built its reputation on the promise of bulletproof data protection, marketing their services with slogans like, "Your data, our guarantee," and 99.99% uptime, 100% peace of mind. Now they were facing the possibility that they might never be able to fully restore their clients' trust, regardless of whether they recovered the lost data. By noon on Saturday, the recovery team had exhausted all conventional options. The corrupted primary database was beyond repair, the backup systems had failed systematically, and the tertiary backups were still inaccessible until Monday. TechFlow Industries was facing the very real possibility that they would have to declare bankruptcy and shut down operations permanently. But then someone remembered something that would change everything. At 12:47 p.m. on Saturday, Marcus suddenly looked up from his laptop with an expression that caught everyone's attention in the crisis room. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the tense conversations happening around the conference table. "During our training on Tuesday, didn't Jennifer mention something about an archival system that runs independently from the main backup infrastructure?" Rachel Morrison stopped mid-sentence in her phone conversation with the tertiary backup facility. "The archival system? Marcus, that's just for long-term storage of historical data. It's not designed for operational recovery." But Marcus was already pulling up the system documentation on his laptop. "No, look at this. The archival system creates complete snapshots of the entire database every Sunday night for compliance purposes. These snapshots are stored on completely separate hardware, with their own power supply, their own network connections, everything." The room fell silent as the implications of Marcus's discovery began to sink in. If the archival system had been running normally, there should be a complete snapshot of the database from the previous Sunday, just 6 days old. While 6 days of lost data would still be catastrophic for many clients, it was infinitely better than losing everything. Sarah immediately began searching through the archival system logs while David Kim called the compliance department to verify the status of the Sunday snapshots. The compliance manager, Janet Rodriguez, was initially confused by the emergency call, but quickly confirmed that the archival system had completed its weekly snapshot successfully at 11:47 p.m. the previous Sunday. "The snapshot contains everything," Janet explained over speakerphone. "Customer data, financial records, system configurations, transaction histories. It's a bit-for-bit identical copy of the entire production database as it existed Sunday night." For the first time in nearly 24 hours, there was a glimmer of hope in the TechFlow offices. But accessing the archival snapshots wasn't as simple as copying files from one server to another. The archival system was designed for long-term storage, not rapid deployment, and restoring a complete database from the archival snapshots would require careful planning and execution. The archival data was stored on magnetic tape drives housed in a climate-controlled vault in the building's basement. The tapes contained compressed and encrypted data that would need to be carefully extracted, verified, and restored to new database servers before normal operations could resume. The process was estimated to take 18 to 24 hours under ideal conditions. Rachel Morrison assembled a team of 6 senior engineers to handle the restoration process. They would work in shifts around the clock, carefully monitoring each step to ensure that no additional data was lost or corrupted during the recovery. Sarah and Marcus volunteered to assist with the restoration, despite having worked without sleep for over 30 hours. "You two have done enough," David Kim said gently. "Go home, get some rest, and come back Monday morning. We'll handle the restoration from here." But Sarah shook her head firmly. "With respect, David, we caused this problem and we want to be part of fixing it. We understand the system architecture better than anyone except the senior team, and you need all the help you can get." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We're not leaving until the data is restored and the clients are back online. This is our responsibility too." The restoration process began at 2:30 p.m. on Saturday. The first step involved physically retrieving the correct magnetic tapes from the basement vault and loading them into the tape drive systems. Each tape contained approximately 50 terabytes of compressed data, and there were 17 tapes required for a complete restoration. As the first tape was being read, the team discovered another complication. The archival system had been storing data in a slightly different format than the current production database, due to software updates that had been implemented over the past 6 months. This meant that the restored data would need to be converted and reformatted before it could be used in the current system. The conversion process added another 6 to 8 hours to the estimated restoration time. They were now looking at a minimum of 30 hours before TechFlow could resume normal operations, assuming no additional complications arose. Every minute of delay meant more angry customers, more potential lawsuits, and more damage to the company's reputation. By Saturday evening, the media coverage had intensified dramatically. TechCrunch had published a detailed article about the data loss, and other major technology publications were picking up the story. Social media was buzzing with speculation about the extent of the damage and whether TechFlow would survive the crisis. Competing cloud service providers were already reaching out to TechFlow's clients, offering expedited migration services and discounted rates for businesses looking to switch providers. The vultures were circling, ready to capitalize on TechFlow's misfortune and divide up their client base among themselves. The restoration team worked through Saturday night, carefully monitoring the progress of each tape as it was read and converted. By Sunday morning, they had successfully restored approximately 60% of the database, and the process was proceeding smoothly. But they still had 12 more hours of work ahead of them. For more content like this, subscribe and activate notifications. Sunday afternoon brought both hope and new challenges to the TechFlow restoration efforts. At 2:15 p.m., the team encountered a critical error while processing the 13th magnetic tape. The tape drive suddenly stopped responding, displaying a hardware failure message that sent a wave of panic through the crisis room. "The tape drive is dead," announced Tom Bradley, the senior hardware technician who had been monitoring the restoration process. "We've lost contact with the tape and I can't get it to eject properly. If we force it out, we risk damaging the tape and losing that segment of data permanently." The failed tape contained customer data for approximately 15,000 business accounts, including some of TechFlow's largest and most important clients. Losing this data would mean that even with the successful restoration of the remaining database, these clients would still be missing critical information about their accounts, transactions, and configurations. Rachel. Morrison immediately called the hardware vendor for emergency support, but it was Sunday afternoon, and getting a technician to the TechFlow offices would take at least 4 hours. Every minute of delay pushed their estimated restoration time further into Monday, increasing the likelihood that major clients would abandon TechFlow before the system came back online. Sarah, who had been quietly studying the technical specifications of the tape drive system, suddenly spoke up. "I think I can fix it," she said, her voice cutting through the tense discussion among the senior engineers. "During my internship at DataVault Systems, I worked extensively with this exact model of tape drive. The error code we're seeing usually indicates a mechanical jam in the tape transport mechanism." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that attempting to manually repair the tape drive carried significant risks. If Sarah made a mistake, she could permanently damage not only the jammed tape, but potentially the entire tape drive system, making it impossible to read the remaining tapes. Marcus looked at his colleague with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Sarah, if something goes wrong, we're already in the worst possible situation," Sarah replied. "But if I can fix this, we can have the full database restored by tonight, instead of waiting until Tuesday morning for a replacement tape drive." David Kim faced an impossible decision. Trust a junior employee who had been with the company for exactly 1 week to perform a critical hardware repair that could determine whether TechFlow survived the crisis, or wait for professional technicians and risk losing major clients to competitors. If you were in charge of an $800 million company, would you trust a new hire with everything on the line? After a tense 5-minute discussion among the senior management team, David made his decision. "Sarah, you have permission to attempt the repair, but you'll work under direct supervision from Tom, and if there's any indication that the situation is getting worse, you stop immediately." Sarah nodded and walked over to the tape drive system with Tom beside her. Using specialized tools from the hardware maintenance kit, she carefully opened the tape drive housing and examined the internal mechanisms. The problem was exactly what she had suspected. A small piece of magnetic tape had become caught in the transport rollers, preventing the tape from moving properly. Working with surgical precision, Sarah used a pair of long-nose pliers to carefully extract the jammed tape fragment without disturbing the rest of the tape or damaging the sensitive drive heads. The entire repair took only 12 minutes, but those 12 minutes felt like hours to everyone watching. When Sarah successfully ejected the tape and reinserted it into the drive, the entire crisis room erupted in applause. The tape drive resumed normal operation, and the restoration process continued without any data loss. For the first time since Friday afternoon, it looked like TechFlow might actually survive the crisis. Subscribe and activate notifications if you want to see more revelations like this. By 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, the database restoration was complete. All 847 terabytes of customer data had been successfully recovered from the archival snapshots and converted to the current database format. The new production servers were online and responding normally to test queries from the engineering team. But the restoration was only the first step in getting TechFlow back to normal operations. The recovered database was 6 days old, which meant that all customer transactions, account changes, and system configurations from the past week were missing. This represented thousands of business-critical operations that would need to be reconstructed manually. The customer service team had been working throughout the weekend to compile lists of all the transactions and changes that had occurred since the previous Sunday. Working with accounting records, email confirmations, and client communications, they had managed to identify approximately 80% of the missing operations. The remaining 20% would require direct communication with each affected client to verify account balances, recent transactions, and system configurations. This process would take several days to complete, but it was far better than the total data loss scenario they had been facing just 24 hours earlier. At 11:15 p.m. on Sunday, David Kim made the announcement that everyone had been hoping to hear. TechFlow Industries will resume normal operations at 6 a.m. Monday morning. All customer data has been successfully restored, and we are implementing enhanced backup verification procedures to prevent this type of incident from occurring again. The celebration in the TechFlow offices was subdued but genuine. Everyone understood that while they had avoided complete disaster, the company's reputation had been severely damaged, and rebuilding client trust would take months or years of flawless performance. Sarah and Marcus finally allowed themselves to feel relief for the first time since Friday afternoon. Their first week at TechFlow had been a nightmare, but they had also proven themselves capable of handling extreme pressure and contributing to the solution, even when facing career-ending consequences. But the real transformation was just beginning. Monday morning at TechFlow Industries felt like the first day of a completely different company. As employees arrived at the office, there was a palpable mixture of relief, exhaustion, and determination to rebuild what had been nearly lost forever. The servers were humming normally, the monitoring screens showed green status indicators, and customer service representatives were fielding calls from clients who were cautiously optimistic about accessing their data again. David Kim called an all-hands meeting at 9 a.m. to address the entire company about the events of the weekend and the path forward. The main conference room was packed with employees who had worked around the clock to restore the database, along with those who had spent the weekend fielding angry phone calls from confused and frustrated clients. What happened this weekend was a failure at every level of our organization, David began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had nearly watched his company collapse. It wasn't the fault of 2 new employees who were trying to do their jobs correctly. It was a systemic failure of our backup infrastructure, our testing procedures, and our emergency response protocols. The investigation had revealed the full scope of the problems that led to the crisis. The backup verification bug had been present for 3 weeks, but the automated reporting systems had hidden the failures from the administrators who should have caught them. The tertiary backup system had been experiencing intermittent problems for 2 months, but these issues had been classified as low priority and never properly investigated. Most damaging of all, TechFlow's disaster recovery procedures had never been tested in a real-world scenario. The company had been operating under the assumption that their backup systems would work perfectly when needed, but no one had ever verified this assumption through comprehensive testing. We're implementing immediate changes to prevent this from ever happening again, David continued. Every backup will be verified manually until we can redesign our automated verification systems. We're establishing a dedicated disaster recovery team that will test our procedures monthly, and we're investing in completely redundant backup infrastructure with real-time synchronization. The financial impact of the crisis was significant but not catastrophic. TechFlow would face approximately $12 million in immediate costs for emergency hardware, consultant fees, and customer compensation. Several major clients had already indicated they would be terminating their contracts, representing about 8% of the company's annual revenue. But surprisingly, many clients had responded positively to TechFlow's transparent communication throughout the crisis. Instead of trying to minimize the problem or blame external factors, the company had provided hourly updates about the restoration progress and had taken full responsibility for the failures that led to the data loss. Sarah and Marcus were called into David Kim's office at 10:30 a.m. for a private conversation about their future with the company. Both of them had prepared resignation letters, assuming that their involvement in the crisis would make their continued employment impossible. "I'm not accepting your resignations," David said before either of them could speak. "What happened this weekend wasn't your fault, and your response to the crisis proved that you're exactly the kind of employees TechFlow needs. You identified problems that senior administrators had missed, you worked around the clock to fix them, and Sarah's hardware repair saved us at least 18 hours of downtime." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either Sarah or Marcus had expected when they walked into the office that morning. Instead of being terminated for their role in the crisis, they were being offered leadership positions on the new disaster recovery team that TechFlow was establishing. "We need people who understand what it feels like when everything goes wrong," David explained. "You've seen our systems fail from the ground up, and you've experienced the pressure of trying to fix critical problems under impossible circumstances. That experience is invaluable for building better procedures and preventing future disasters." The offer came with significant salary increases and the opportunity to work directly with external consultants who were being brought in to redesign TechFlow's entire backup infrastructure. Sarah would lead the backup verification team while Marcus would head up the new testing and simulation division. Both of them accepted the positions, understanding that their experience during the crisis had taught them more about database management and disaster recovery than years of traditional training could have provided. They had seen the worst-case scenario play out in real time, and they were uniquely qualified to help prevent it from happening again. The customer communications team spent Monday reaching out to every affected client individually, explaining exactly what had happened and what measures were being implemented to prevent future incidents. The response was better than expected. While some clients were understandably angry, many appreciated the honesty and transparency of TechFlow's communications. By Tuesday morning, 95% of TechFlow's clients had been successfully restored to their pre-crisis status. The remaining 5% required additional manual reconstruction of recent transactions, but even these complex cases were being resolved ahead of schedule. The media coverage, which had initially been devastating, began to shift toward a more positive narrative about corporate responsibility and crisis management. Several technology publications wrote follow-up articles praising TechFlow's transparent communication and comprehensive response to the disaster. If you're feeling emotional, activate the bell and subscribe. 3 months after the crisis, TechFlow Industries had not only recovered from the near-catastrophic data loss, but had actually strengthened its position in the competitive cloud services market. The disaster recovery procedures that Sarah and Marcus had helped design were being studied by other companies as examples of best practices in database management and crisis response. The transformation at TechFlow went far beyond technical improvements. The company culture had fundamentally shifted from one that assumed systems would work perfectly to one that planned meticulously for when systems would fail. Every employee, from junior administrators to senior executives, now understood that backup systems were only as reliable as the testing procedures that verified them. Sarah had become something of a legend within the company and the broader tech industry. Her quick thinking during the tape drive repair had saved TechFlow millions of dollars and countless hours of downtime. More importantly, her systematic approach to identifying and documenting system failures had become the foundation for TechFlow's new quality assurance procedures. Marcus's analytical skills, which had first identified the backup verification problems, were now being applied to continuous monitoring systems that could detect similar issues before they became critical. The testing protocols he developed were so comprehensive that they had actually identified and prevented 2 other potential system failures in the months following the crisis. The disaster recovery team that Sarah and Marcus led had grown to 12 full-time employees, making it one of the largest departments in the company. Their monthly disaster simulations, had become legendary among TechFlow employees. Comprehensive tests that could shut down entire sections of the company's infrastructure to verify that backup systems would perform correctly under real-world conditions. Subscribe if you believe that these stories need to be told. The financial impact of the crisis had been completely offset within 4 months. While TechFlow had lost some clients immediately after the incident, the company's transparent handling of the crisis and demonstrable improvements to their infrastructure had actually attracted new clients who were impressed by their commitment to reliability and accountability. The quarterly board meeting that had been scheduled for the Monday after the crisis had been delayed by 2 weeks, but when it finally occurred, the investors were surprisingly supportive of TechFlow's response. The funding round that had seemed impossible during the crisis was successfully completed, with investors citing the company's crisis management and infrastructure improvements as reasons for their confidence. David Kim often reflected on how the worst weekend of his professional career had ultimately led to the strongest period in TechFlow's history. The crisis had exposed weaknesses that might have remained hidden for years, growing more dangerous with each passing month until they caused an even more catastrophic failure. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a company is a controlled disaster, David would tell other executives at industry conferences. Not a disaster that destroys you, but one that forces you to confront your weaknesses and build something stronger than what you had before. The relationship between Sarah, Marcus, and the rest of the TechFlow team had evolved into something unique in the corporate world. Instead of being blamed for triggering the crisis, they were respected for their role in identifying and solving systemic problems that predated their employment. Their colleagues understood that anyone could have triggered the same cascade of failures under the same circumstances. For more revelations like this, subscribe and activate notifications. The tech industry as a whole began to take notice of TechFlow's transformation. The company was invited to present at major conferences about crisis management and disaster recovery. Their backup verification procedures were adopted by dozens of other companies, and Sarah and Marcus became sought-after consultants for organizations looking to improve their own infrastructure reliability. But perhaps the most important lesson that emerged from the crisis was about corporate responsibility and transparent communication. TechFlow's decision to immediately acknowledge their failures and provide detailed explanations of their recovery efforts had set a new standard for how technology companies should handle major incidents. The contrast was stark when compared to other companies that had experienced similar data losses, but had attempted to minimize the problems or blame external factors. TechFlow's honest communication had actually strengthened their relationship with clients, while companies that had tried to hide or downplay their failures often suffered long-term reputational damage. Sarah and Marcus had learned that the technical skills they had developed in university were only part of what was required to succeed in the corporate world. Either ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, to take responsibility for mistakes, and to work collaboratively toward solutions was just as important as understanding database architecture or system administration. 1 year after the crisis, TechFlow was named Cloud Service Provider of the Year by Tech Review magazine, with the judges specifically citing the company's industry-leading disaster recovery procedures and transparent client communication. The award ceremony was attended by over 500 technology executives, and Sarah and Marcus were invited to speak about their experience and the lessons they had learned. The recognition was gratifying, but both of them understood that their real success was measured differently. Standing on the stage at the Tech Review Awards ceremony, Sarah looked out at an audience of technology executives and entrepreneurs who represented billions of dollars in corporate value and millions of jobs worldwide. 18 months earlier, she had been a recent college graduate with impressive grades but no real-world experience. Now she was being recognized as one of the industry's leading experts in disaster recovery and crisis management. The most important lesson we learned, Sarah told the audience, is that failure is not the opposite of success. It's the foundation of success. When Marcus and I accidentally triggered the crisis at TechFlow, we thought our careers were over before they had really begun, but that crisis taught us more about database management, corporate responsibility, and leadership than any amount of traditional training could have provided. Marcus, standing beside her at the podium, continued the thought. We learned that the systems we trust most are often the ones we test least. TechFlow's backup infrastructure looked perfect on paper, but it had never been tested under real-world conditions. Our mistake wasn't causing the crisis. Our mistake would have been ignoring the warning signs and allowing the problems to grow even worse. The audience listened intently as Sarah and Marcus described the technical details of the crisis and the systematic changes that TechFlow had implemented in response. But the most powerful part of their presentation wasn't about technology. It was about the human elements of crisis management and corporate responsibility. When everything goes wrong, Marcus explained, the natural instinct is to find someone to blame and try to minimize the damage to your reputation. But we learned that the opposite approach, taking full responsibility and communicating transparently about both the problems and the solutions, actually builds stronger relationships with clients and employees. TechFlow Industries had not only survived the crisis but had emerged as one of the most respected companies in the cloud services industry. Their client retention rate was now over 98%, and they had a waiting list of companies wanting to migrate their data to TechFlow's infrastructure. The disaster recovery procedures that Sarah and Marcus had helped design were being licensed to other companies, creating an entirely new revenue stream. The personal transformation that Sarah and Marcus had experienced was even more remarkable than TechFlow's corporate recovery. They had gone from junior employees who were afraid to ask questions to industry leaders who were invited to speak at conferences and consulted by major corporations about crisis management and infrastructure design. But success hadn't changed their fundamental approach to work and responsibility. They still arrived at the office early, still double-checked their procedures, and still maintained the same attention to detail that had allowed them to identify the backup verification problems during their first week of employment. The crisis taught us that there's no such thing as a perfect system, Sarah concluded her presentation. There are only systems that fail gracefully and systems that fail catastrophically. Our job as technology professionals is to build systems that can survive their inevitable failures and to create organizations that can learn and grow stronger from their mistakes. The standing ovation that followed lasted for over 3 minutes. Industry executives who had initially viewed Sarah and Marcus as cautionary tales about the dangers of hiring inexperienced employees now saw them as examples of how the right people can turn crisis into opportunity. David Kim, who was in the audience watching his employees receive recognition for their transformation of his company, reflected on how the worst weekend of his professional career had led to the best period in TechFlow's history. The crisis had forced the company to confront weaknesses that might have remained hidden for years, and the solutions they had implemented had made them stronger than their competitors. 6 months after the award ceremony, Sarah and Marcus made another significant decision. They announced their intention to start their own consulting company, specializing in disaster recovery planning and crisis management for technology companies. TechFlow's board of directors unanimously approved the plan, with the company becoming the consulting firm's first major client and strategic partner. The consulting company, which they named Resilience Systems, quickly attracted clients from across the technology industry. Companies that had experienced their own data crises sought out Sarah and Marcus's expertise, while others wanted to implement proactive measures to prevent similar disasters from occurring. Their first major client outside of TechFlow was a financial services company that had experienced a smaller-scale database corruption incident. Within 6 months, Resilience Systems had helped the company redesign their entire backup infrastructure and implement comprehensive testing procedures that identified and prevented 3 potential system failures. The success of Resilience Systems validated everything that Sarah and Marcus had learned about turning crisis into opportunity. What had started as the worst possible beginning to their careers had ultimately led them to become entrepreneurs and industry leaders in a field that hadn't even existed when they first walked into TechFlow's offices. Today, 5 years after the crisis, TechFlow Industries remains one of the most respected cloud service providers in the industry, with backup procedures that are considered the gold standard for reliability and transparency. Sarah and Marcus's consulting company has worked with over 200 technology companies, helping them build more resilient systems and develop better crisis management procedures. But the most important lesson from their story isn't about technology or business success. The real lesson is about how we respond when everything goes wrong. Sarah and Marcus could have blamed the faulty backup systems, resigned in shame, or spent their careers trying to distance themselves from the crisis. Instead, they took responsibility, worked tirelessly to fix the problems they had uncovered, and used their experience to help others avoid similar disasters. Their story proves that failure, handled correctly, can become the foundation for extraordinary success. The crisis that nearly destroyed their careers ultimately became the defining moment that launched them into leadership positions in their industry. Sometimes the worst day of your professional life is actually the first day of something much better than you ever imagined possible. If you believe in the power of turning crisis into opportunity, if you believe that failure can become the foundation for success, and if you believe that taking responsibility for mistakes is the first step toward extraordinary achievement, then their story offers hope for anyone facing their own professional crisis. The new hires who deleted the only copy of their company's database became the leaders who redesigned the industry's approach to data protection and crisis management. Their mistake became their mission, and their crisis became their calling. And sometimes, that's exactly how the best stories are supposed to end.